Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you enter a forest at night? That's exactly how I felt when my best friend invited me to a party on a stormy night. But when we arrived, the party resembled a macabre ritual. Human statues, dark robes, and an inverted cross awaited us. And what if they saw us too? Stay tuned to find out what happened when the forest revealed its darkest side. It was a Friday night like any other in our small, quiet town. I, a 19-year-old young woman, had been working as a cashier at the only supermarket in the area for almost 2 years. Life was simple but pleasant, and I looked forward to unwinding after an exhausting week of work. The air was heavy with the scent of impending rain, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon, foretelling a stormy night. My phone vibrated with a message from my best friend since high school. "Hey, there's a party in the forest tonight. Bonfire, music, the whole gang. You in?" I read the message a few times, hesitating. I wasn't much of a partygoer, preferring quiet nights with a good book, but the idea of a night under the stars with my friends sounded tempting. Plus, it was a chance to escape the monotony that sometimes suffocated our small town. After a few minutes of deliberation, I replied affirmatively and started to get ready. As I brushed my hair, I glanced out the window of my bedroom, noticing the elongated shadows of the trees on the horizon. The forest had always fascinated and frightened me in equal measure. Its stories and legends were an integral part of our local culture, whispered around bonfires and passed down from generation to generation. I put on a jean jacket over my favorite t-shirt, preparing for the cold we would surely feel in the forest. As I applied some makeup, I couldn't shake the thought that something about this night felt different, as if the air was charged with strange and unpredictable energy. My friend picked me up around 9 p.m., accompanied by another classmate. The old car, an 80s Chevrolet that had belonged to her father, rumbled loudly as we drove through the familiar streets of our town. The lights of the houses passed by in a blur, and soon the residences gave way to open fields and finally to the dense forest that surrounded our community. "Does anyone know exactly where this party is?" I asked, feeling a slight chill in my stomach as we ventured onto the dirt road. We had left the asphalt behind a few minutes ago, and now we were surrounded by the oppressive darkness of the forest. The driver shrugged, her eyes fixed on the poorly lit road. "More or less. They said it was past the curve of the old oak tree. We'll find it, don't worry." The trees loomed like black shadows outside the car window, and the darkness seemed to engulf everything around us. The dirt road stretched before us, an uncertain path in the dense night. The silence inside the car was broken only by the occasional sound of branches scraping against the bodywork, creating a tense atmosphere that foretold the scary night ahead. My friend in the back seat fiddled nervously with the radio, trying to tune into a station, but all we could hear was static interspersed with unintelligible whispers. "This forest has always given me the creeps," she murmured, giving up on the radio. "Do you guys remember the story about the old lumberjack who disappeared here in the 50s? Before we could answer, the driver exclaimed, "There it is!" pointing to a flickering light among the trees. "It must be the party's bonfire." Without hesitation, she turned the car onto a side trail descending a steep hill. The vehicle shook violently, making us grip the seats. The sound of branches scratching the sides of the car was like nails on a chalkboard. As we drew closer, a strange feeling began to wash over me. Something didn't seem right. The light of the bonfire had a peculiar glow, more intense and reddish than expected. And where were the sounds of music and laughter that we had anticipated? The silence was disturbing, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When we reached the end of the trail, the engine was turned off. The silence that enveloped us was oppressive, almost palpable. Instinctively, I placed my hand on the door handle, but something made me hesitate. "Wait," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "Something's wrong." My friends looked at me confused but obeyed, the tension palpable in the air. Through the fogged-up windshield, we tried to decipher the scene before us. That's when I noticed there were no other cars, and the figures around the bonfire, they didn't move like people at a party. They were motionless, like statues, dressed in what appeared to be long, dark robes. The realization that we were about to witness one of the true scary stories of night walks hit me like a punch in the gut. My heart raced, and I felt a chill down my spine. as I grasped the seriousness of the situation. "Start the car," I urged quietly, my voice almost failing me. "We have to get out of here. Now." My hands shook as I locked the doors, fearing that at any moment those sinister figures might turn towards us. The driver, her eyes wide with fear, turned the key. The engine coughed and hesitated, making a deafening noise in the silence of the night. For a terrifying moment, I thought the car wouldn't start, leaving us trapped in this horror scene of night walks. My friend in the back seat started crying silently, her fear palpable in the confined space of the vehicle. Finally, after a third desperate attempt, the engine roared to life. As we turned around to leave, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A red inverted cross was staked at the side of the road, shining macabrely under the headlights. How had we not seen it on the way down? It was as if it had appeared out of thin air, a sinister warning of the danger we had just escaped. The car sped down the dirt road, shaking violently. Branches scraped the sides, and stones ricocheted off the chassis, creating a cacophony of terrifying sounds. I looked back through the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures chasing us, but there was only darkness. The forest seemed to close in behind us, swallowing any evidence of our passage through that cursed place. "What was that?" asked my friend in the back seat, her voice broken by sobs. No one answered. What could we say? We had just experienced one of those scary night walk stories we had always heard about but never really believed. The reality of what had happened began to sink in, and a heavy silence fell over the car as we drove away from that disturbing place. The way back to the town seemed endless. Every shadow on the roadside made my heart leap, imagining the worst possibilities. Haunted night walks like this would be forever etched in our memories, I was sure. The silence in the car was broken only by the occasional sobs of my friend in the back seat and the rapid breathing of the driver, who clutched the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. Finally, the familiar lights of our small town appeared on the horizon, a beacon of normalcy amid the chaos we had experienced. A wave of relief washed over me, but the tension was far from gone. We stopped in front of my house, none of us wanting to be alone after what we had witnessed. You saw what they were wearing, right?" I asked hesitantly, breaking the silence that had settled. The others nodded slowly, their faces pale in the streetlight. "Black robes," the driver murmured, her voice still trembling. "Like some kind of ritual." The mention of rituals and ghostly roads made my whole body tremble. My friend in the back seat added, her voice almost a whisper, "And that inverted cross, do you think it was some kind of cult?" The word hung in the air, laden with sinister implications. As we discussed the events of the night, we began to grasp the gravity of what we had witnessed. It wasn't just one of those scary road stories we told to frighten each other. It was real, tangible, and utterly inexplicable. The inverted cross, the motionless figures, the absence of other cars, everything pointed to something far beyond our comprehension. We decided not to tell anyone about what happened, at least not yet. Who would believe us? Scary night walks like this would sound like a made-up story to most people, but for the three of us, that night changed everything. Darkness now carried a new meaning, and deserted roads at night would never be the same again. As we said our goodbyes, promising to stay in constant contact in the coming days, I knew that this experience would bind us forever, united by the shared terror of a night that was supposed to be just another teenage party. I watched the car drive away, carrying my friends back to their homes, and felt one last shiver as I stepped into my house. That night, lying in my bed with the lights on and the curtains tightly closed, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those sinister figures around the bonfire, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a question lingered. What if they saw us too? Have you ever imagined hitting the road at night and coming across something you just can't explain? On that autumn night, fog and darkness enveloped us, and a ghostly figure appeared in the middle of the road. Was it a child or something else? Get ready for one of the creepiest stories I've ever lived through. Don't go anywhere and find out what really happened on this scary trip. It was a chilly autumn night when I decided to hit the road with my younger sister. I A 32-year-old man living in a small rural town had gone to pick her up from college in the neighboring town. The dashboard clock read 11:45 p.m. as we entered the highway that would take us back home. The air was dense, and a thin mist hung over the asphalt, creating a setting worthy of scary true ghost stories of night walks. The trees on the roadside loomed like misshapen shadows, their twisted branches resembling skeletal fingers pointing to the starless sky. My sister was quiet, fiddling with her phone, the bluish light of the device illuminating her young face. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Something in the air made me uneasy, a sense of discomfort I couldn't explain. "Are you okay?" my sister asked, finally breaking the silence. "You seem tense." I shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "These night drives always keep me a little alert, you know." She nodded, turning her attention back to her phone. I knew she wasn't a big fan of these night drives, but it was the only way to pick her up after her late classes. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowed by the darkness beyond the reach of the car's headlights. As I drove, I couldn't help but think of the stories I had heard about scary night walks, urban legends about ghostly drivers, apparitions on the roads, and unexplained accidents. I shook my head, trying to dismiss these thoughts. They were just stories, nothing more. But on that night, with the fog thickening and darkness surrounding us, it was hard not to feel a bit apprehensive. As we approached the town, the tension in the air seemed to increase. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the road. My sister had fallen asleep, her face occasionally illuminated by the headlights of passing cars. Suddenly, something caught my attention. A small figure appeared in the middle of the road, just a few meters ahead. My heart raced as I realized it was a child. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet asphalt. "My God," I shouted, waking my sister up. Time seemed to slow down. The child was right in front of us, motionless. I could see her wide eyes reflecting the light of the headlights. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable impact. But it never came. When I opened my eyes again, the road was empty. "What happened?" my sister asked, her voice trembling with fear. I was breathless, my hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Did you see it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "The child. She was right there?" My sister looked at me, confused and scared. "What child?" There was no one on the road. I shook my head, incredulous. I was certain of what I had seen. It was a real child. It couldn't have been just my imagination. Or could it? This incident reminded me of one of the horror stories on the road I had heard once. A driver swore he had seen a child crossing the highway late at night, only to find out it was the ghost of a girl who had died there years before. Could this be what we had just experienced? One of the truly scary stories we feared so much. With my hands still shaking, I started the car again. The silence was palpable, broken only by the sound of the engine and our accelerated breathing. My sister and I exchanged nervous glances, both trying to process what had just happened. "Are you sure you saw a child?" my sister asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I'm absolutely sure. She was right there in the middle of the road. I don't understand how she just disappeared." We continued our journey, now at a slower pace. Every shadow on the road seemed like a threat, every reflection in the rearview mirror a potential apparition. It was as if we were trapped in one of those haunted night walks we only heard about in horror stories. When we finally reached the familiar streets of our town, I felt a momentary relief. The lights of the houses and the occasional passing car brought us back to reality, but the sense of discomfort persisted, as if something had fundamentally changed in our perception of the world. I parked the car in front of our house, turning off the engine with a heavy sigh. For a moment, we sat in silence, neither of us wanting to be the first to leave. "What do you think that was?" my sister asked finally, her voice breaking the silence. I shook my head, uncertain. "I don't know. It could have been a trick of the light, an illusion caused by fatigue, or something we can't explain." The possibility that we had experienced something truly supernatural hung in the air, unspoken but clearly present. As we walked into the house, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time at the dark street. The shadows seemed to move, and for a moment, I thought I saw something stir in the darkness. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. That night remained etched in our memories, one of the scariest night walk experiences we would ever forget. Although we never discovered the truth about what we saw, the memory of that ghostly child on the road continued to haunt us for a long time. It was well past 1 a.m. when we finally went inside. The silence that accompanied us during the rest of the trip persisted, heavy and full of unasked questions. My sister murmured a barely audible goodnight before heading to her room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Unable to sleep, I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were still trembling slightly as I held the glass. The image of the child on the road remained vivid in my mind, as if it had been burned into my retina. It was one of the most real horror stories on the road I had ever experienced. I sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the dark, quiet street. The shadows seemed to move outside, playing with my already overactive imagination. I thought about all the stories I had heard about ghostly roads and chilling night walks. I never imagined I would ever be the protagonist of one of them. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in the silent house, marking the minutes that dragged on. I picked up my phone, hesitant, and started searching for similar experiences. To my surprise, I found several accounts from drivers who claimed to have seen ghost children on deserted roads at night. Every story I read made my heart race as I recognized elements of my own experience. When the first rays of sunlight began to seep through the kitchen window, I realized I had spent the whole night awake, immersed in reflections and research. The daylight brought a certain comfort, dissipating some of the fear that the darkness of the night had amplified. But the questions remained. What did we really see on that road? Was it possible that we had witnessed something truly supernatural? Imagine going out for just another regular late-night drive and suddenly coming across something you never expected. 3 sinister clowns emerge from nowhere, turning a simple red light into a surreal nightmare. Want to know how I escaped this bizarre encounter? Stay tuned until the end. It was just another regular late-night drive in my life as a dedicated student. At 17 years old, I had already established a rigorous routine, waking up at 4 a.m., driving to the gym, working out, and then heading to school. This commitment to my physical health and education was something I took very seriously, even if it meant sacrificing a few hours of sleep. I lived in a small town in the countryside, where the streets were practically deserted at this time of night. My route was always the same. I'd leave home, take the main avenue, and in 15 minutes, I'd arrive at the gym. The way was so familiar that I could have done it with my eyes closed. On that early September morning, the air was colder than usual. I was wearing my favorite hoodie and carrying my backpack with my school books and a change of clothes for after my workout. I started the car, a used sedan my parents had given me when I got my driver's license, and set off for another day of exercise. The streets were silent and dark, illuminated only by streetlights that cast eerie shadows on the empty sidewalks. I enjoyed this moment of solitude. It was as if the whole town was mine for a few moments. Little did I know that this tranquility was about to turn into one of the scariest night walks of my life. I approached the traffic light on the main avenue, the only one on my route. Usually I would pass through it on green, but that morning the light turned red. I stopped the car and waited, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of the low music playing on the radio. That's when I noticed something strange moving on the crosswalk in front of me. I squinted, trying to see better in the dim light, and my heart raced when I realized what it was. 3 figures dressed as clowns slowly approaching my car. My body froze at the sight of those 3 bizarre figures approaching. The clowns walked in sync, their slow, deliberate steps echoing in the silence of the early morning. Their white makeup shone in a surreal way under the yellowish light of the street lamps, creating distorted shadows on their faces. Fear took over me, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, remembering the horror stories about clowns that circulated on social media and in the news. Some were just pranks, but others were much more sinister. The traffic light stayed red, an eternity passing with each second. The clowns were now just a few meters away from my car, their painted smiles seeming to grow wider as they drew closer. The one in the middle was particularly frightening. His makeup was more elaborate, with red lines coming out of the corners of his mouth, as if it were blood. My survival instinct screamed at me to get out of there immediately. I looked both ways down the street. There were no other cars in sight. The town seemed to have been swallowed by a sepulchral silence, as if I were trapped in one of the haunted night walks from the stories I used to hear. Without thinking twice, I floored the accelerator. The car roared forward, speeding through the intersection and leaving the clowns behind. Through the rearview mirror, I saw their silhouettes getting smaller, still standing in the middle of the crosswalk, like macabre statues on a ghostly highway. My heart was pounding as I drove well above the speed limit, eager to get to the gym. The empty streets passed by in a blur, my mind replaying the surreal encounter I had just experienced. That scary moment of my night walk would be forever etched in my memory. When I arrived at the gym's parking lot, I stopped the car and turned off the engine with shaky hands. I took several deep breaths, trying to calm down. I looked around, half expecting to see the clowns following me, but the parking lot was empty and quiet. I grabbed my phone, thinking of calling someone, maybe the police, but hesitated. What would I say? That I ran away from 3 scary clowns during my night walk? It would sound crazy. Besides, I had broken the law by running the red light. I decided to keep this story to myself, at least for now. With my legs still wobbly, I got out of the car and made my way to the gym's entrance. The familiar facade of the building, normally so welcoming, now seemed strangely threatening. As I walked, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, fearing to see those painted smiles watching me from the shadows. I entered the gym, the familiar smell of sweat and disinfectant greeting me like a strange form of comfort. The night receptionist, a middle-aged man with deep, dark circles under his eyes, greeted me with a sleepy wave. I tried to act normal, forcing a smile as I swiped my membership card. During my workout, I couldn't focus. My eyes darted at every movement in the shadows, every reflection in the mirrors. The image of the clowns persisted in my mind, their macabre smiles mixing with the metallic sound of weights being lifted and lowered. The hours passed slowly, each minute a torture of anxiety and fear. Finally, with the sunrise, it was time to go to school. I gathered my things in the locker room, my hands still trembling as I zipped up my backpack. The idea of going out on the streets again terrified me. I stood at the gym's door, looking out at the now illuminated parking lot. It looked safe, normal, but I knew I would have to face the same way back, passing through the same intersection. The possibility of another terrifying night encounter made me hesitate. With slow and cautious steps, I made my way back to the car. Every sound, the chirp of a bird, the distant rumble of an engine made me jump. I quickly got into the car, locking the doors as soon as I sat down. For a moment, I sat there, taking deep breaths, gathering the courage to make the return trip. I started the engine and drove out of the parking lot. The streets were different now. With the usual morning rush, people hurried to work. Other cars passed by me. The normality of the scene was almost surreal after what I had experienced. I approached the fateful intersection, my heart racing again. The traffic light turned red and I stopped, my eyes frantically scanning the area for any sign of the clowns. There was nothing but ordinary pedestrians crossing the street. The light turned green and I drove on, a mix of relief and confusion washing over me. Did I imagine the whole thing? Was it just a particularly vivid nightmare? But no, I knew it was real. The fear I felt was too intense to be just a product of my imagination. I arrived home and got ready for school, my mind still replaying the events of the early morning. I decided not to tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? Scary road stories were common, but mine seemed too absurd to be true. In the following days, I continued my routine, but something had changed. Every night walk became a trial. Every shadow on the streets, a potential threat. The haunted roads were no longer just legends to me. I had experienced the true horror of an inexplicable encounter on the deserted streets of the early morning. Weeks went by and slowly, my routine started to normalize again. The intense fear I felt that night faded, replaced by a constant vigilance during my night walks. Still, I couldn't completely forget what had happened. One afternoon, while flipping through the local newspaper at the school cafeteria, something caught my attention. It was a headline that made my blood run cold. Mysterious clowns terrorize residents during the early morning hours. My heart raced as I read the details. According to the article, several people had reported scary encounters with 3 clowns wandering the town's streets in the early morning hours. The descriptions matched perfectly with what I had seen. The most disturbing part was that no one knew who these individuals were or what their intentions were. The local police had been notified but had not yet identified or located the culprits. The article mentioned that the sightings had occurred in different parts of the town, always at times when the streets were practically deserted. A mix of fear and validation washed over me. On one hand, knowing that I wasn't the only one to witness that sinister scene brought some relief. On the other hand, the confirmation that those clowns were still out there, with no explanation, made the whole situation even scarier. That night, lying in my bed, I reflected on the whole experience. What I had gone through was just one of the many horror stories on the road that were now circulating in the town. The uncertainty about who those clowns were and what they wanted turned every night walk into a potential scary encounter. In the following days, the topic dominated conversations at school and in the town. Theories arose from all sides. Some thought it was a prank. Others feared it was something more sinister. The authorities advised calm but urged caution, especially during night walks. This experience taught me several lessons. I learned about the importance of trusting my instincts, about how fear can spread quickly in a community, and about how reality can be just as scary as any work of fiction. I also realized that true scary stories don't always have a clear explanation or a definite ending. Today, years after that event, the mystery of the nighttime clowns has never been fully solved. Occasionally, rumors of new sightings arise, reviving the fear and speculations. Our town's ghostly roads have gained a new layer of mystery, and every lonely intersection during the early morning hours carries with it the possibility of a terrifying night encounter. My story has become just one among the many mysterious nightwalk stories that are now part of our local folklore. It's a constant reminder that the unknown can lurk in the shadows of the night, turning simple journeys into scary night walks that stay with us forever. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.